Andoni Iraola has a control problem, because twice in consecutive games this pre-season, his Liverpool team have thrown away 2-0 leads and ended up losing. And with the opening game of the Premier League season rapidly approaching, he doesn't have a huge amount of time to find solutions. So how will Liverpool play this season? And will it be enough to keep Iraola in a job? Now there's actually two parts to this control problem. The first is out of possession control, because Iraola's made a name for himself by controlling the opposition when his team don't have the ball. So let's dig into this idea a little bit more with a quote from Iraola himself from an interview that he gave with The Independent. And what he says here is, "We try not to give the teams the time to play their positional patterns because everyone is prepared to exploit the spaces they have been training." And the thing to focus on here is this idea of not giving oppositions time to play the ball. Now, why might that be important? Well, Iraola goes on. "If you are brave, they, the opposition, have to play a game that is not their preferred game. We try to find these scenarios, especially against big teams, because they are used to absolute control and the patterns they want. We try, even if it's risky, to make the game different. I think it improves our chances, even if it doesn't always work." So the idea here is that by denying the opponents time on the ball, Iraola's teams are going to actually destabilise them in their in-possession phase, and this will prevent them from being able to control the game. Now the best way of stopping the opponent from having any time on the ball is to use some form of man marking. So we can see on the board here, the red team getting really close to the white team's players, and that just reduces the amount of time that they have on the ball and will force them to play the ball quickly. But as Iraola points out, this is actually quite a risky approach, because if the opposition find ways of playing through your man-to-man press, often these large spaces will open out in behind that press that can be exploited by the opposition. And that's why many teams will use more zonal approaches to defending, where the focus is on covering space rather than covering individuals. But this has the opposite problem, which is that now you're being so passive, the opposition do have space and time on the ball in their build-up. Now this presents a problem for Iraola, because how do you utilise man-to-man ideas without your structure completely collapsing? But how do you then protect your structure without becoming completely passive? And his solution to this is to use a hybrid approach. What you do is you take man-to-man principles, but you marry them together with zonal principles, and you hope that you're able to get the best of both worlds. And what you end up with is a hybrid structure, which on paper may look like a zonal structure, but these players aren't worried about covering zones. They're actually more interested in having good access to the opposition players so they can arrive in those man-to-man moments. But at the same time, they're not so tightly connected to their man-to-man responsibilities that they lose sense of structure altogether. What you end up with is this between structure where you can push into man-to-man moments, but also fall back into more zonal situations as well. So that's the theory. What does it look like on a football pitch? Well, I've got a sequence of play here from when Bournemouth beat Arsenal at the end of last season. Now the difference between this and older approaches to man marking is that in older systems, what you generally do is each player has one marking responsibility. Actually, in this system, it's slightly different, because each player is going to have 2 or maybe even 3 players who are their marking responsibilities. So in this instance, we can see Evan Nielsen, his responsibility is William Saliba and David Raya. So he's often going to make these curved runs to try and block the passing lane between the two of them. And so he has what I like to call a hybrid position. He's responsible for 2 of these players. And we can see these hybrid positions opening up all the way down the field. So Junior Krupi, he's going to jump up onto Gabriel, but he's also responsible for Declan Rice. And if he jumps onto Gabriel, then Rice will be left free. That's not an issue because Alex Scott can jump up onto Declan Rice. Now, again, every time a player is jumping forward, they're leaving space behind them or a player behind them to cover. And in this instance, Alex Scott, as the deeper of the 2 pivots, his job is to protect this space in front of the back line. So the question is, how are we going to cover this space? Well, there's solutions here as well. So this is Marcos Senesi. He is the centre back on the left-hand side, and his job is to cover the opposition striker in this instance where possible, so you have double coverage, but also he is responsible for stepping forward into this space. And one of the things his responsibility will include to cover Kai Havertz here, who's dropping off that front line. At the moment, we've got Marcus Tavernier here, making sure that Havertz isn't free, but Marcus Tavernier is also in a hybrid role. His job is to come across to Ben White as well. And so what we have across the pitch is all of these hybrid responsibilities, which will enable Bournemouth to keep their structure, but still have access to players to retain man-to-man when they need to, when the ball is in their vicinity. Now, it may look a little bit scary at times because in this instance, for example, because Marcus Tavernier is blocking out the middle, they want to make sure there's not space in the middle. You might get someone like Ben White free. But the whole idea here is about speed. It's about making sure that your players have access to their marking responsibilities so that when the ball is played to them, in this instance if the ball goes to Ben White, Marcus Tavernier is going to be able to arrive quickly enough to put Ben White under pressure so he has no time on the ball. And if he does have to move out wide, then Kai Havertz is going to be free, but there will be other solutions coming from other players elsewhere on the pitch. So in this instance, what we actually see is it looks like David Raya is going to play the ball out to the right-hand side. And so when Tavernier starts moving across to cover Ben White, what we actually see is his teammates making sure that Kai Havertz is going to be covered. We've got Senesi now stepping much further forward than he was, but we've also got Alex Scott aware of Havertz's position so he can jump in as well, and because he's coming across, then Ryan on the far side is going to come across narrow to make sure there's double coverage on Declan Rice as well. So what we can see across the field is all of these hybrid roles being played by the Bournemouth players. That enables them to get man-to-man, but it also allows them to protect their structure. So let's just run the tape on to see what happens, because in this instance, Bournemouth are going to start pressing David Raya to put him under pressure. You can see Evanilson making that curved run, stopping the ball from getting to William Saliba here. But interestingly enough, that now makes William Saliba the free man. So Arsenal's task is to try and get the ball to William Saliba, and the way that they do that is by having Declan Rice dropping in to play a bounce pass into this area. And this may look quite scary for Bournemouth because you've got two free players now on this side because they're protecting the middle. But again, this is about having good access to the opposition, because by the time the ball arrives at William Saliba's feet, we can see that Bournemouth have been able to shift across. Evanilson is now on Saliba, but we can see that Ryan Christie is covering the pass into the midfield, and Marcus Tavernier has access to Ben White, and then Marco Senesi is covering that space in between the lines. So by the time the ball arrives there, there's really good access for Bournemouth to actually close off all of the options. And in the end, William Saliba ends up going back to David Raya. Now again, Arsenal are going to try and run the same kind of routine. Here's Zubimendi dropping in, and he's got access into this wide area, two free players here. But actually by the time the ball arrives at his feet, you can see again that there's a Bournemouth player immediately on him, meaning that this pass out wide is quite risky for him because he's been rushed, because the speed is so quick. The best option for him is to just play the ball back to David Raya. David Raya is then under pressure from Evanilson, and what he does then is play the ball long, actually really quite high in the air because he's under so much pressure, and then we have a bit of head tennis and the ball goes out for a throw-in. So this shows us a few things. The first one is the way that Bournemouth are using speed to prevent their opponents from being able to benefit from their really nice in-possession structure. But the other thing is that it gives us a pretty good indication of how difficult it is to play in this kind of system, because the players have lots of responsibilities. They all have to interpret what's going on. They have to be able to read the distances between their responsibilities, and they also have to decide when to go from one to the other. And then on top of all of this, all of the players have to get all of their responsibilities right all the time, because as soon as one of them gets something wrong, the whole system can collapse. And this explains why Liverpool have been so sloppy so far in pre-season, because they don't have the ability to actually control the game out of possession for a full 90 minutes. Now this may seem a little bit alarming with the season fast approaching, but there are a couple of caveats here. Firstly, Liverpool have looked quite good in first halves, which does suggest that the Liverpool players are starting to understand the principles and how they are to be implemented. And this is a good sign, because you'll remember that when Iraola started at Bournemouth, it took them about 10 games to get up to speed. If the Liverpool players can get there a little bit quicker, that'll be really good. Another thing to point out is that things started going wrong in second halves because Liverpool made a lot of substitutions at half time. Now this does raise questions about Liverpool's lack of depth, but it's also a good explanation for why things went so horribly bad in those second halves. But the most important caveat here, I think, is that the Liverpool players just aren't up to the level of fitness and intensity that Iraola requires. So here's a quote from after the Monaco game that he gave to LiverpoolFC.com, where he said, "The problem is right now they don't have the energy for 90 minutes and they start to get tired. It will take time with them. We need more training with them." Now that's not great for right now, but it does suggest that in time this Liverpool team will get up to speed with the fitness, and then suddenly all of these principles will start clicking into place and they'll start to look as dangerous as Bournemouth did by the time Iraola left. Another thing to note is that some of these problems can be fixed in the transfer market, and one advantage of Iraola's hybrid approach is that his teams can benefit from market inefficiencies. Because by focusing on getting proximity to opposition players rather than more spatial ideas about defending, Iraola can use a different type of profile of player that many of the other elite sides tend to go for. For example, in the pivot spots at Bournemouth, it wasn't unusual to see him fielding Ryan Christie and Alex Scott, where most elite sides would probably want to go for a more physically dominant, large space defender. Think Declan Rice. All of which means there's plenty of scope for Liverpool to sign another midfielder before the window closes, because they have a broader profile requirement than most of the other elite sides. So when it comes to solving the issue of out of possession control, it's probably a question of when, not if. But the timing does matter here, because if it takes too long for Iraola's Liverpool side to start resembling his Bournemouth side out of possession, then questions may be raised about the feasibility of this project in the long run. But this brings us to a second control problem that Iraola has to fix. Because it's all well and good playing with this level of intensity when you're Bournemouth and you're only playing once every weekend, but Liverpool are going to be playing in Europe, and they're also going to be expected to go deep in the domestic competitions as well. That's going to mean a lot of midweek fixtures. So there's a question about the sustainability of this approach when you're an elite side and you have to play many more games. A potential solution to this problem is to offset out of possession control with in possession control instead, with the idea being that if you can control the game with the ball, you won't have to do as much controlling of the game without the ball. So if Iraola can find a way for his Liverpool side to hold onto the ball more, then there should be less concern about the physical demands of his out of possession approach. But there's another problem here, and that is that Iraola's in possession approach also requires a level of intensity, and I've got another quote from Iraola to explain what I mean by this. So here's the quote coming from that interview with The Independent. He says, "We have to prepare patterns, but we cannot just prioritise them. If you can see that you don't have a teammate ahead, forget about the pattern, just drive the ball and try to force things to happen. I want him to attack first." Now there's a couple of things to notice here. The first is that with the ball, Iraola is still trying to do similar things to what the elite sides are doing. So he emphasises we have to prepare patterns. And what he means by that is that his teams are going to try and have some kind of in-possession structure to control the game. But he carries on. We cannot just prioritise these patterns. If you can see that you don't have a teammate ahead, forget about the pattern and just drive with the ball and try to force things to happen. So there's a sense in which Iraola wants to destabilise the opponent with the ball as well. And again, this is all about speed. That's what he's talking about in this quote. He's saying if we can get the ball forward quickly, then the opponent isn't going to be able to fall back into their defensive shape. There's going to be lots of space to exploit, and we can actually generate attacking advantage in this way. Now this all sounds very theoretical at this point, so let's take a look at the board to see what it looks like in practice. And what I want to emphasise is that for Iraola, these in-possession structures are important. He's going to get his team to use these structures to work the ball down the field into dangerous attacking scenarios. And there's two elements to this, I think. One is vertical and one is horizontal. Now, in a vertical point of view, I think what's really interesting is when you see his teams building up, they are going to stack themselves at lots of different line heights. And the reason that they do this is because it's a nice way of generating space. It spreads the opponents out, and you can use these spaces to move the ball down the field. And one of the interesting things I think to note is that these players will be constantly switching height so that you're dragging players with you. Again, that's going to help you to generate that space. And then when it comes to width, you'll often see Iraola teams using these wide areas to generate ball progression as well. And they do this through something that's often called double width. The idea of double width is just having two players in the same channel, often quite close together. And this represents itself, for example, as the ball coming to the winger dropping in, again, dragging that player with him, and that being a trigger for the fullback to find a run into the space behind. And you'll often see these two players supported by a central midfielder. You'll get those triangles that they can use to just progress the ball through lines of pressure into these dangerous areas where you can find cutbacks or crosses. But the in-possession side isn't all about generating advantages through this structure, and that's what the quote from Iraola was all about. He was saying if there's scenarios where you can actually directly cause problems for the opponent, then you should take them. The one that he mentions is carrying the ball. So you'll often see a centre-back in this sort of situation where he's received the ball, he has space in front of him. Iraola wants him to dribble into that space to start pulling the opposition apart and finding these solutions through the lines. And the other thing is that if you get into any problems whatsoever when you're building up, then Iraola is very happy for players to just launch the ball long down the field into an area where they have players preferably. And the reason why he's happy to do that is because his teams are so good out of possession with the intensity that they will use this as a situation to try and win the ball back, counter press, and maybe generate a counter attack of their own. But this flies in the face of what we've just said about Liverpool using in-possession control to prevent the need for out-of-possession control. Because if you're going to play in this risky and direct way, then it's going to mean you're losing the ball more, which just means you're going to have to do more defending. And we've suggested that actually Liverpool should be trying to do less defending. And this presents another potential problem for Liverpool, because if Iraola's in-possession approach gets a lot of its upside through this direct play, then trying to control the ball a little bit more means that they're not going to be able to get as much of those advantages in that in-possession style. Because if you look to control the ball more, more, you're not just losing the risk of playing more directly, but you're also losing the threat that you actually generate in those moments too. And Iraola knows this. I've got a quote from his interview with the Anfield Wrap recently where he talks about this, and he says, "Everyone says you need to add more control, and we know this. We are working on it. But we can't lose the things that made us successful." And this is the problem of in-possession control in a nutshell. If you're going to try and use ball possession as a way of preventing yourself from having to use too much intensity off the ball, how do you use ball possession to save your team from having to rely on intensity off the ball without losing your attacking edge? But I think Iraola already has a solution to this. So this is a sequence of play from the end of last season when Bournemouth beat Man City, and I think it shows some principles that actually Iraola could use at Liverpool to help him solve some of these problems. So in this situation, Bournemouth have just got possession back after a Man City long ball. We can see the centre-back has the ball at his feet. And I think the first thing to notice is that Bournemouth are thinking about their in-possession structure. The players are moving into different areas of the pitch to give plenty of options for their teammate. But actually, interestingly enough, we see a nice example of space opening out in front of the centre-back and the centre-back driving to actually access that. So we can see Marcos Senesi is going to see that area, he's going to drive towards it. That's already going to start destabilising the opposition's defensive structure. But when Senesi starts coming under pressure from the opposition players, we can then see the way that Bournemouth players are staggering themselves vertically, as I described before. And this allows them to have a number of different solutions to be able to move the ball down the field. So you can see Marcus Tavernier here dropping in to be able to receive from Senesi if he wants to. We've also got the fullback here, Adrien Truffert, moving into the space down the line. Also, this is Evan Nielsen, the striker, moving across the field into this space too, but we've also got the number 10 all the way up the pitch, forcing the Man City line backwards. So you can see this way, Bournemouth are able to actually create space between the lines. And in the end, the ball ends up in the wide area with Adrien Truffert. We've talked about that double width that is there, but at this point, they don't want to take any risks. And so actually what ends up happening is that Truffert is going to play it back around the back line across to the other side. This is already an example of actually using control rather than doing what you would maybe expect an Iraola team to do, which is go direct all the time. Once we get to the other side of the pitch, we now have the ball over here. And again, there's not really the situation for Bournemouth to get any advantage by going direct. And so they decide to come back round again. What this is doing is it's slowing the game down. The problem is that by the time the ball arrives back around at the other side of the pitch, we can see that City are in a really nice compact defensive structure, and you've lost any advantage that you can get from playing quickly. So the big question is, how are Bournemouth going to be able to generate the kind of attacks they want to with City in this sort of scenario? And the answer to that is by playing backwards, because what ends up happening is that Truffert plays it to Senesi, Senesi plays it to James Hill, and James Hill returns it to the goalkeeper. And what this does is this decompresses the Manchester City press. And again, we're now in a situation with the ball is at the goalkeeper's feet, and now we have this vertical staggering that we see all the way down the field, which they can then use to be able to attack quickly at speed. So let's have a look at what that looks like. The ball comes out to Alex Scott. He plays a bounce pass with, I think this is Tyler Adams, just around the player. He receives the ball again in this situation. We can see Marcus Tavernier has dropped in. He's actually going to do a double movement. That's why I put the two arrows here. So what he's going to do is he's going to force Matheus Nunes as though he's going to go in behind. So you can see his momentum is going the wrong way, but then he's going to turn, go back towards the ball, and this is going to open out enough space for him to receive that pass comfortably. Now, at the same time as he's dropping in, we can see Adrien Truffert making that double movement, so making the run into the space that's opened up in the fullback area. And so when Tavernier receives the ball, he's actually able to feed the ball into the channel where we've got Adrien Truffert, who's got momentum over Matheus Nunes, and he can make that run into the channel, receive the ball, and then he's able to play the cut back to Junior Krupi, who's able to find a perfect finish into the top corner. So what we have here is a really nice example of how you can introduce ideas of control with possession, not having to attack directly all the time, but then have solutions in which to create the scenarios where you're able to attack directly in the way that an Iraola team might want to. So Iraola has a control problem, but he also has solutions at his disposal to solve them. And the success or failure of this season will depend on how well he can find these solutions.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football